I hope you're having a great week this week, and welcome back to our journey through the minor prophets, the book of the 12. This morning we're looking at the book of Nahum, or Nahum, depending how you want to say it. There's very little known about this particular author. In fact, the book says virtually nothing about him. It's just an oracle concerning Nineveh, according to verse 1, the book of the vision of Nahum of Elkosh. There it is. He's from Elkosh. Problem is, we don't even know where that is. So the book is clearly not about Nahum. We don't know who he is, what he's like. The book is about God's message to us through Nahum, and the message of that book is, what is God like? Now, based on what's described here, we know that Nineveh is the target immediately in God's eyes here. The same Nineveh that was spared under God's grace and mercy in the book of Jonah. They left their unrepentant ways. They repented. God spared them under Jonah's ministry. That was sometime in the mid-700s, early 700 BC. 722, though, another generation of Ninevites had forgotten that turn, that change of heart. They attacked the northern kingdom of Israel. They'd taken the people into captivity. And now, approximately 100 years later, they're ready to invade the lower kingdom of Judah. Now, Nineveh was a great nation, mighty nation. The city itself, the fortified citadel of the city, was surrounded by walls 100 feet tall, according to legend, and so large that it was wide enough for 3 chariots to run side by side across the top of the wall. And then the city itself was then further surrounded by a moat that was, according to reputation, 150 feet wide and 60 feet deep. And so they were convinced they were safe. Their city was impregnable. No one could touch them, and therefore they could do whatever they wanted. God, however, sent Nahum to give them an oracle. Oracle literally means a burden. In other words, what Nahum gets to deliver is what Jonah wished he could have, a message of condemnation and judgment on the people of Nineveh. But in the book, what we discover is ultimately the book is about God, God's character. And what we discover is God's character determines God's actions. And likewise, God's character should define our hope. And all of this can be really found summarized neatly, packaged for us in a nice little way at the beginning of chapter 1, starting at verse 2. So let's read verses 2 through 8. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in the whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither. The bloom of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him. The hills melt. The earth heaves before him. The world and all who dwell in it. Who can stand before his indignation? Who can endure the heat of his anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are broken into pieces by him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. But with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of the adversaries and will pursue his enemies into darkness. And so, what is God like? In fact, there are 5 statements about God's character in that first little bit we just read. If you go back to verse 2, it's clear the first thing he mentions about God's character is the Lord is a jealous God. Now, jealousy in humans is bad. It's based on unrealistic desires for attention or affection. We're not worthy of that. We're imperfect. We have no right to be jealous. But God is good. God is perfect. And therefore, God is perfectly worthy of all that. And so he's jealousy. He's going to protect his reputation and his character. He's going to share his glory with no one. That's why the 10 Commandments, you'll have no other gods before me. The New Testament, you can't serve both God and mammon. God's jealousy demands our loyalty, our commitment to him. Verse 2 also speaks of God's vengeance. The Lord is an avenging God. It is a warning that this sovereign king who determines the rules, he broaches or accepts no disobedience. And so his vengeance demands our obedience. Notice as we go through it, he talks about him avenging, vengeance. The idea is it's certain. He's keeping wrath. He's got it. He's storing it up for his enemies, and there's no escaping it. Adam and Eve could not run or hide. And the book of Romans says in Romans chapter 6, verse 23, that the wages of sin, they will be paid. The wages of sin is death. Third characteristic of God is mentioned in verse 3. He is slow to anger. God is patient. And his patience, strangely here for a moment may seem, demands our attention. This is a common confession in the Old Testament. God is slow to anger. God, in Exodus 34, as he passed before Moses, sinners are seeing God, they're afraid he's leading to death. God's grace withholds that from Moses. Jonah, in Jonah chapter 4, seems to speak with God and survive. The wrath of God is not always immediate, but it doesn't mean that wrath is not impending. It doesn't mean that God's not going to one day judge and bring justice. And so we must not take God's patience for granted. We must not presume upon his grace. We must not delay while we wait for his answer, our own. And so his patience should get our attention. Why is he not angry yet? And what's it going to be like when he does get angry? Verse 3 also says that he's great in power, that God is sovereign, and that demands our utmost respect. Now, of course, theologians talk about the omnipotence of God, it being all-powerful, that he can do whatever he sets his mind to do. Now, he's sovereign over man, he's sovereign over the creation. His ideas and themes repeated throughout the book of Nahum, repeated throughout the Bible, that no matter how great the man is, God is greater still. No matter how great the nation is, God is greater still. You want the proof? Our cemeteries are full of great men, and history is littered with dead and gone kingdoms that people thought would never fall. And so what Nahum is saying here is don't mistake God's patience for weakness. It's a warning. The Lord, he says, will by no means clear the guilty. It may not happen yet, but it is coming. Another character of God here in verse 7, God's goodness. Now, the whole section we've been looking through is what is known as an acrostic. It's an alphabet poem. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and one song like this, the next verse builds on the next verse, A, then B, then C, then D. Verse 7 stands out in all that because verse 7 doesn't follow that pattern. All these warnings about who God is, and then verse 7, the author breaks the pattern so that it stands out, so it jumps off the page at us. And what does verse 7 say? The Lord is good. Here's God's omnibenevolence, his all-loving nature on display. In fact, it says in verse 7 that he's steadfast, he's a stronghold in our day of trouble. So he's good, he's our hope, he's our protection. He is love. It says he knows those who take refuge in him. He knows them not intellectually, knows them emotionally, intimately, loves them. But it all hinges on something else on our part. What's required of us? Faith. Verse 8. But with an overflowing flood, he'll make complete the end of his adversaries, and will pursue his enemies into the darkness. Whoa, wait a minute, you say. You said there's hope and there's faith. Where's that in verse 8? Verse 8 tells us what happens when you don't exercise those things. And you could say by implication, therefore, we must do the opposite. But actually, remember back at the end of verse 7, that's the transitional point into this warning of judgment. He knows those who take refuge in him. They're going to come to him, those who are faithful. They're going to seek him out and trust him. On the other hand, those who don't, he'll bring the complete end to his adversaries. And if they don't run and they don't die, he'll pursue them even into the darkness. You can run, but you can never hide. And so Nahum warns us, this is the God we're dealing with. Make sure you deal with him carefully and correctly. And then just to make sure we get that, chapter 2 contains one of the strongest warnings in the entire book. Chapter 2, verse 13. Behold, God says, I'm against you, and I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard. Now, there are other woes and there are other warnings in the book as you get into chapter 3, but the gist of the book is this. Either you will come to God for protection, believing and trusting in those character traits that are outlined there in verses, that is, of chapter 1, verses 2 through 8, or you'll flee from him. But one way or the other, you must deal with him. Those who come to him in faith, he'll rescue, he'll love you, He'll be your stronghold, and those who run will die. Behold, I am against you. How much more frightening can the words of the Bible be than that? That the God who created the universe, who wants to love you because of your sin, is against you, and it's not going to end well for you. He who has ears, let him hear, and come to the Lord now.